I want to talk to you about my experiences practicing BIM in the continents of Europe, Africa, and North America. First, let's do some backstory. Why did I sort of hop around the world looking for a place to practice BIM? I started my BIM journey managing BIM for one of Nigeria's foremost architectural firms, and they were looking to implement BIM, having me on board. Now, when I started that job, I thought, I'm just doing my best, but surely someone else, somewhere else in the world is doing BIM better than this. Maybe there are ways I can learn, and maybe there are ways I can improve, right? So I'm sure if you're familiar with the BIM space, you know that people in Scandinavian countries like Norway or Finland, definitely England, are far ahead with BIM. So I started looking for opportunities to either study or work abroad. I first did a master's in architectural design at the University of Sheffield in England, and after my studies I was able to work in the UK. Also, my research there was very BIM heavy and BIM focused, right? I thought, okay, in England definitely everyone is doing BIM. Of course, they are typically more advanced than, say, the rest of the world, but then everywhere I go there was always something lacking, either in implementation procedures or standards, or maybe just lack of technical expertise from the team. So I had to move back to West Africa after my studies and working for about 4 months in the UK. And I became a BIM manager. Like I said earlier, I taught myself a lot of the things I needed to do on the job, because learning BIM academically and implementing on the job are two completely different things. BIM on the job has a lot to do with people management, more so than technical knowledge or expertise. And I felt, okay, I'm doing well, but I want to know more. I want to see how they're doing BIM elsewhere. This utopian place that exists where everything is perfect and BIM is being implemented to the letter. And so I was fortunate to get accepted into the European BIM A+ Master, like I've spoken about in my previous videos. And after that master, I got a job offer in Italy at the time to join a firm that was also kind of at the cutting edge of BIM. But even then, I got the impression from talking to people in Italy that they still felt like they're behind in BIM. And then after that, I moved to North America. This is where I've chosen to live for now. And so even though I had to leave Europe, I had this feeling that, okay, maybe things might be a little better, or at least there might be a better culture towards adoption in North America, right? And I moved to Canada. And again, still that same concept from people that, oh, we're doing our best here in Canada, but we're kind of behind. There's people ahead in BIM. And just going on comments on LinkedIn, one of the channels I follow religiously is the Aussie BIM Guru, and I've seen his comments on how BIM is like in Australia. I've come to the conclusion that everyone is doing their best. While some countries are in fact ahead of others, there is no someone doing better. We're all really doing the best we can. So I'm going to do a comparison based on my experiences on what BIM was like in these 3 corners of the world, and I'm going to base my comparison on standards, which means like presence of a regulation of some sort, whether that's documented standards or legislation from the government on enforcing implementation. Education, meaning how much support do people get right out of school, meaning formal university education for BIM. And also culture, so the general appreciation or reception towards BIM in these countries. And finally, funding, how much money do people have to throw at BIM. So let's start with standards. I think of all the continents I've lived on, which is Europe, North America, Africa, Europe has the highest collective group of countries that has actual regulatory standards that are enforced and that are required on projects. As far back as 2016, the UK passed the Digital Build Britain law, where projects for the government had to reach BIM level 2 at the time. The legislation helped. There is a lot of legislation in countries like Britain, Norway, Finland. I might be missing a few, but those are the superstars in Europe at the moment. So definitely in terms of standards, Europe is leading the charge. In North America, there are bodies like Building Smart who are implementing roadmaps and plans for the future. One of the conferences I attended recently, they kind of demonstrated a clear roadmap for the next couple of years on how BIM should go in Canada. And I think having those sort of roadmaps and plans are helpful, but in terms of enforcing people to change their practices to start implementing BIM, I think that having more legislation helps. There isn't as much in Canada in terms of legislation, even in terms of standards. So in most countries, there is some version of the ISO 19650 being implemented. And the ISO is supposed to be a guideline that other countries are supposed to build on. So it's not supposed to make people do something that doesn't work. So England is supposed to have its own addition or improvement upon the ISO. So is, say, Nigeria or Canada, where I am right now. There isn't much in terms of an official document like that in Canada, but I know that there are plans to have one. So in terms of legislation or standards, Canada is still catching up. In Africa, there are regulatory bodies like the Standards Organization of Nigeria that regulate things like the ISO. While there isn't any formal ISO document that has been written for BIM specifically, you have organizations like BIM Africa that have been partnering with other foreign institutions to make yearly reports and dictionary definitions of BIM terminology just to improve implementation. So there also is not as much as Europe in terms of standards in Africa, but there is a significant effort from non-governmental organizations like BIM Africa to create some degree of streamlining requirements, definitions for data exchange. So let's talk about education. Again, Europe is leading the charge in terms of having accredited master's programs that you can do. I know of a few in the UK, and I know of the ones that I did in Europe, for example. I think there are many universities in Europe that will offer you an accredited 1 year or 2 year master's degree program in BIM, which sort of makes you qualified, because again, this is a profession in as much as BIM is a subsection of the architecture, engineering, and construction profession. It is a profession on its own, and having accredited education is what makes you competent. In Canada, there aren't as many programs. I think most of the master's degree or PhD programs that are funded are typically centered around heritage preservation, because that's a big topic of conversation here in Canada. And in Nigeria as well, I don't think there are any accredited BIM programs. But I will say that the architecture education in Canada and Nigeria have heavy modules and courses that enforce knowledge of things like how to model, how to use certain tools, energy modeling, and so on. There are courses within architecture curriculum that address BIM subjects. So lastly, let's talk about culture and funding. Overall, I think that there is a better culture towards BIM in Europe and in Africa. Again, because of legislation and education, the culture in Europe towards BIM is very, very ahead of these other two continents. You would typically go into a firm and see that there's already some degree of BIM being implemented, or there's already conversation about improving the practices in the company to have more BIM implementation. In Africa, even though there isn't a formal structure or standards organization requiring this, the engineers themselves see the value in technology. So you would go into a firm, and typically, especially in architecture, all of the architects would be very advanced in using a tool like Revit or ArchiCAD. In North America, on the other hand, I found that there is a bit of more resistance even though people are now implementing tools like Revit, I still see scenarios where people do things like importing CAD into Revit just to have a Revit model. I wouldn't have seen something like that in Africa, for example. I think that most of the professionals there have taken the effort to educate themselves on how to use those tools, and so they are quite advanced. However, I would say that in Canada, the people who know BIM very well. So there are specialists who have taken their time in their career to say that they want to be BIM specialists, and those people are very competent, but they are not as many as the regular architect or engineer who still prefers to use AutoCAD. But in terms of not requiring a sort of push from a higher power, whether that's a client or a government or regulation, I think that the culture of BIM in Africa is probably the best I've experienced, which will lead me to my next point about funding. I think that there's a lot of resources financially in North America, possibly more than even in Europe. I don't have extensive experience in that aspect while I was in Europe, but I've seen that here there isn't any sort of restriction on investing in BIM. In Africa, it's the opposite. There isn't as much in terms of finance to just throw at BIM, and so it forces people to be creative. Because to be fair, if you are someone who is managing several projects in Canada, for example, roles are very specific. So if you do one thing, that is your role, that's what you do. In Africa, you do everything. You are the architect, you are the interior designer, you are the landscape architect. If you have that much work to do, you want to do it fast, you want to do as effectively as possible, and BIM helps you do that. So you find people implementing BIM just because it's like a common sense thing to do, not because the subscription is particularly affordable. One Revit subscription can pay a bunch of intern architects for a month in Africa. So it's not cheap at all, and I think that's a different conversation about how countries or continents even are excluded when companies are fixing these prices and requesting these subscription costs from firms. But that's my point, is it seems almost like because there are less financial resources to throw at these things, people get more creative to see how they can leverage tools to be more efficient. In Europe, again, they're just more advanced in BIM implementation, so you have a bit of balance in terms of people who have the skill and people who own the tools. And of course there's more funding because it's supported by the government, it's part of legislation, right? So there's more support for funding. But somehow I feel like my experience, at least here in North America, is that there's just more in terms of money to pay for tools. One of the biggest challenges to BIM implementation that people point out is how expensive it is. And just based on my experience here, at least in a firm where the projects are large enough to require BIM, because of course you always have the smaller firms or the small businesses that would still have the cost of BIM as an issue. But I find there's not as much reluctance here to pay for tools. When you have several countries in the same continent speaking different languages, I think it impacts how much of an overall implementation you can have. To what extent, I'm not an expert to say, but I think one of the advantages of Canada is that we all know that it's English, right? So it doesn't matter what part of Canada you're in, the tool will be in English, the standard will be in English, and so it's easier to sort of roll things out to the public. So overall, I guess the question will be which place is better, or where has BIM been implemented to a more advanced level? Without a doubt, it's Europe. The research shows that Europe is ahead when it comes to BIM because they are advanced in terms of legislation, having government support. They have resources and funding towards BIM. They have the technical expertise. And also, they just have a culture of innovating and jumping on the bandwagon of innovation. I think it's unfortunate that Africa is typically left out of the conversation when these metrics are being evaluated. I read a couple of articles preparing for this where comparisons on BIM adoption was being made, and Africa wasn't just included in the conversation, even though you do have organizations like BIM Africa working towards pushing this information out there. So I hope that I'm able to do that more on my channel, because I do have that experience. There's a lot in Africa regarding just overall technological adoption, whether that's VR or photogrammetry, point cloud scanning, or AI. There's a lot of people doing really good work and interesting work in technology in general. So I'm looking forward to seeing Africa more in the conversation. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this and you want to support me so I can keep doing more videos, please subscribe. Your subscriptions tell me that I'm doing something right and that you like the content I'm bringing, and that I can just keep doing more.